Well, hello, and welcome to another Discover Headless Tech interview from headlesscreator.com. I'm Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me, Marcelo, at headlesscreator.com. Now, today's episode is going to be really cool. It's about the GUI experiences and how they are within a composable content system. So we're going to have a really good conversation about that. And my guest is Larry Swanson. He's actually back. He's been here before, had great conversations with him. He's a full stack content architect from Ellis Media. But before we get started, you know how it works. I'm going to tell you real quick about headlesscreator.com. Go get your free account. You'll have access to this live stream later available on demand, and you're also going to have access to the entire course as well. So you see there are plenty of lessons to watch in there, tons of stuff. You'll have access to all that. You're also going to have access to all the upcoming live streams, all of the courses we have. There's just plenty of stuff for you there. So go ahead and get your free account. You won't regret it. And like I said, if you want, get a hold of me, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and get Larry in. Larry, welcome. Glad to have you here.
Great to be back, Marcelo. Always fun to talk with you.
It really is. I mean, you're a wealth of information, especially when it comes to content architecting and content modeling, which I'm a big fan of. So thank you for being here. It's going to be a fun interview. But, you know, for those that haven't watched before, give a quick overview of your background, how you got into CMSs, composable, content modeling, all of that.
Yeah, I'll give the quick version because I've been doing this a long time. I go back to like the days of CompuServe and dial-up modems and Unix command
CompuServe,
line.
what's that? No, I'm kidding.
Yeah.
I know exactly what that is. I used to log into it.
Yeah, I still remember my CompuServe ID. That's just a useless piece of information stuck in my brain. 707.13.3401.
That's so funny.
Anyhow, yeah,
I love it.
Yeah. And since then I've done just I've kind of evolved over the years. Back then I was coming out of book publishing and into digital publishing, did that for many years, got into like all the usual stuff that people of my tenure did, sort of like a lot of SEO, a lot of website building, built a few CMSs. When I want to like be like a cranky old man, I'll just say, back in my day, you had to build your own CMS. I didn't actually build them. I worked with teams of developers to create a couple CMSs. And then over that time, I've kind of gradually re-identified like less and less about publishing and more about user experience design. And more recently, even like service design, thinking about, and the service design comes out of my architecture practice, doing a lot of systems work. And that's, to me, a better way to organize things, because it also has to do with the nature of modern web stuff, that it's all about omnichannel customer experience and really addressing people where they are in their journey. So that's sort of the evolution I've done from this kind of pushy old publisher just shoving information at you to being much more curious about you as a customer and how I can help you with my content.
Well, with the way technology changes, we have to evolve with it and continually, quote unquote, reinvent ourselves, right? Because otherwise, like you said, if we're still stuck in the legacy days of CMS, we wouldn't be doing none of this stuff right now, and things will be moving forward. So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about, the new composable architecture. And as good as all that is, one of the big issues, which is the title of this episode, is that GUI experience, right? Authors are very used to having that WYSIWYG experience with the legacy, which in a composable architecture, it's a different mentality. So why do you think, first of all, why do you think there are so many dissatisfied content authors with this kind of experience right now?
I think that's, and this isn't a thought original to me. Like Greg Dunlap, a guy in the Drupal community, and Dean Barker, the CMS guru, they both say the same things. I've heard them say it many times at conferences and in various conversations. That the reason people hate their CMSs is because the authoring experiences are horrible, and nobody gave them any thought at all. And that's sort of And to this day, like even as a UX practitioner, inordinate amount of our focus is on the end user and not on the enterprise user, the poor person who's working with the CMS. And that's just been true for every CMS of all time. And even the new headless CMSs, I think there's better opportunities for addressing that, but they haven't really been realized yet. Meaning that like the whole thing about headless CMSs is that they're about serving up APIs so that developers can pull information to build websites or apps or kiosks or whatever. There's an analogous opportunity on the back end, I think, to serve authors better, but nobody's doing it yet. So still
Yeah.
waiting.
There was also dissatisfaction with the legacy CMSs from a content authoring perspective.
Oh God, yes, and rightfully so. And I feel bad for having built some of those crummy CMSs. But yeah, and in fact, I think the old, and one of the ways that they did evolve to become more friendly to users is to what you were saying earlier. They became more WYSIWYG, like WordPress famously with their Gutenberg editor and others. Just like I think the rise of like, especially for the small scale sites like Wix and Squarespace, and those are really like page builders that are kind of, to my mind, they're analogous to the old, I'm again being old, I remember when desktop publishing came along and
Right.
you could go from like having to go to the print shop and work with somebody to make a newsletter or something, you could just do it yourself at home. That analogous kind of control and power to authors, and that kind of, what it does is it sort of makes it harder to sort out the roles that are naturally in this. The roles are always there. They're just easier to conflate in those kind of environments. So like you're the author, the editor, the publisher, everybody all in one. And I think that's the issue with authors, is trying to tease apart those roles and help people get where they fit in the current system.
Let's talk a little bit more about this WYSIWYG mentality, which is what you see is what you get. Most people know that, but maybe some people may not know what that stands for, right? But that mentality is more on it's page centric. At the end of the day, it's page centric, meaning that it's a website page, right? And authors want to see, what does it look like before I hit publish on my CMS, on my headless CMS, right? That's one of the things that is not fully there, right, with all of these headless CMSs, is the ability to see exactly how it's going to go. Now, developers can create previews and all this thing, but it takes a while for developers to create this. But to me, the promise of headless and composability isn't so much about what does it look like at the end of the day, is like authors should focus on creating the content, and the front end delivers it the way it's supposed to deliver it. That's really more up to designers and stuff, and authors really don't need to worry about that as long as they have all of the governance within the system set up, where they don't put more characters than it's required for a particular channel. How do we change the mindset of authors? What are some steps we can take to be able to go, I know you really want to see what this looks like, but don't worry about it, because the channel decides what it looks like. It's not all about the web. It's about the IoT device. I call it the A lady, because if I say her name, she'll start speaking. She's right behind me. So, but the Google Assistant, the whatever one you use. How do we change that mindset? What are some steps we can take as an industry, as a department head in a company, to help authors transition properly?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you just said, just kind of repeating that in a context that's like accessible to the end user, because that what you just described is like, and it's not just about composable decoupled systems that makes this come to a head. 10 years ago, we invented the responsive web. It was which was driven by the rise of mobile and the need to have like the same, be able to use, and this was more like a rendering end of the system thing, the responsive web design, which was just like you take the same HTML and render it differently depending on the device you're in. You have media queries and stuff that determine how things look at that end. So we've kind of had sort of this situation, because even back then, even 10 years ago, you couldn't just hit preview and see what you're going to see. I think most preview functions in like CMSs now, they'll have like a choice of like mobile and web, but that's it. And even back then, you had like dozens of different screen resolutions and many different phone screens and stuff
And
like
it's
that.
not just that,
Yeah,
right? Like, for example, SMS, newsletter,
yeah, exactly.
all of these other channels that
Yeah,
I think people need to understand that this piece of content you just created is not going to go just there. It's going to be customer support going to Salesforce.
yep. Yeah, and I think the main way to help people get over into this new era is to think about the content you're creating not as like a specific representation in a specific format, but like how is this content going to help my users solve this problem or
Right.
learn what they need to in the moment. And and then you sort of have like, okay, I can do that. I can kind of figure out like what I need to say here. Now, how do I need to author it, get it into the CMS in a way that it can be used, like in those situations you just described. Can we do this in a way that's both usable as like the description for Google's, for the meta description, and for like a something in a voice, a voice agent or something like that to use, just to start thinking about that. And those are often the actual technical implementation of that will probably be somebody like you or me, or somebody like, or the people we work with on actually implementing that. but but they're, these authors are smart. This is not,
Oh, yeah.
it's like we don't, it's just a matter of just a little bit of a mindset shift that we have to, and that's sort of our job. I feel like for every author who's upset, it's kind of like, I haven't done my job right. That like we should be both building better systems for them, but also in the interim educating them about like, that problem you're facing. And this is me just trying to rustle up more consulting work, just saying like, hey, that problem you've seen, I can help you fix that. But it's true also that like the issues are coming to a head, and just, and again, not just around the different like presentations of it, but it's often happening in the context of like, like kind of some of the big trends driving this, like things like personalization, or organizations that are concerned, they have like a CX chief or a omnichannel strategy of some kind that they're trying to implement. All of a sudden, your role as an author is kind of like, you can't just be writing to one presentation format because they need your work. We're all understaffed. You can't just hire more people for those additional channels. You may need to adapt as an author to go like, yeah, I've been the social media person for a long time, but I guess I'm going to have to start writing for the web or for mobile, or whatever the situation is in your company. Does that make sense?
It totally makes
Yeah.
sense. And what I'm hearing is part of it of improving the composable content experience for an author isn't all on the technology side. Part of it belongs to the author themselves in retraining their thinking, right? Like, for example, and I love your take on this, but many authors, and again, this isn't minimizing their intelligence, this is about just shifting the way they think, right? Because like you said, authors are extremely intelligent, important to the entire process, but rethinking, decoupling that design of how this should look. Like, this needs to be bold and red, and I want to see it bold and red. But the question is, then why is it bold and red? Is focusing on the content and the intent of that content, because the way that intent is presented on an IoT device, which is spoken, is going to be very different than the intent of that bold red on a mobile app, on a SMS, on the web page, right? So if we start thinking in those terms, it's more about intent versus bold and red and the way it looks. And I think part of that is in that retraining.
Yeah, and again, that's one of those places where it's not a big shift in mindset for authors, because you're talking about like semantics there, essentially. Like, what does this actually mean over how is
Exactly.
it going to look? And we're word people, content people are word people, they're language people, they get that. And that's not a big leap to help them get that, like, um, okay, we're conveying meaning here. We're not doing a specific, design thing or a specific voice thing. It's like, we have a message we need to impart at this point in this customer's journey. What are we going to say? And that's something they're infinitely well suited for, but maybe just need a little bit of help. And again, this is back to this is going to be a rant. You're going to just get used to it. I'm going to be saying this for the next 10 years, that like, we really have to get more attention to that enterprise experience of how we create these authoring environments, which is just will become more important as these decoupled architectures take off.
Yeah, and they become important because an author will be managing content that doesn't just reside, let's say, in Contentful, but it resides also in Salesforce, and it may reside in their HR software, because it's pulling information from everywhere, right? And so that means having like a unified entry point for all of this content, and putting and making them go log on to this system, log on to that system to maintain, and having them think about, okay, I need to change this data, where does it belong, which system do I go? I think that goes towards a lot of the frustration with composability. And I know I'm just, everybody knows, Headless Creator is owned by Uniform. Obviously Uniform has a solution for that, so people can go check it out at uniform.dev. But we need to move towards that unified central place where authors can manage all this content without having to think, where does this content belong? Because then that goes towards single source of truth, right? Otherwise, you start duplicating. If you put everything in Contentful, but part of that data, and I'm saying Contentful just because it's Contentful and they're the biggest, but it could be any headless CMS, Sanity, whatever, you pick it. But from an author point of view, they shouldn't have to think like, oh, this is customer information, so I need to go to Salesforce to update it. Oh, this is product information, so I need to go to the PIM. They should be just one place where they just manage all this content.
Yeah. Well, and I know we're focused in this conversation on the authors and helping them, but a lot of what you're talking about there are architectural issues around,
Agreed.
For example, like where do you
but that
single
helps
source
them,
that?
right? Architectural issues helps the content.
Well, and exactly. And as and I've done this a couple of gigs ago. I've done this a few times where as you design these platforms or systems that are, that are sourcing content from any number of places and getting it into both an end user experience, but also that enterprise user experience. Like I did a thing at Expedia where I was working with content designers on how they worked with this. There's an insane amount of content there, like 60 terabytes or petabytes of all the travel. It's an insane amount of data that you had to kind of tidy up and get to where they could work with it. And so we did a lot of work. Some of it's been implemented, some of it's, even when you have resources, it's hard to do it well. But it's about getting, it's as much about getting that the architecture in the back end to support the things that the authors need to do. So what that means is that we need to pay attention to authors across the spectrum of activities. That you can't. You definitely want to think about it as you're like designing a CMS or designing a schema and the workflows and stuff as you configure a new CMS. But you even want to think the next level out, the architectural layer. Like how are we building this thing? For example, I did another thing where I was working with design system content at another big enterprise, and it was just content design guidelines for the design folks, both content designers and other designers. And we came up with a scheme. This is, you'll hate this, but the CMS for that was Airtable. We just did a simple Airtable, which had the documentation in it that we needed, but then we single sourced from that into a Figma plugin we had developers doing that put the information, a subset of that information that made sense in the context of a designer working in Figma, that dropped in there. But then we also sourced it to a comprehensive documentation website, so you kind of did that. Another place, I have some friends who work at IKEA. I recently moved to the Netherlands and I've met just a ton of people from IKEA over here. They're everywhere. And one of my buddies there is working on a Contentful site, and what they're doing part of what they're doing there is they're single sourcing branded content. IKEA is this insanely complex ecosystem. It's one of the best known brands in the world. I have no idea how they keep their brands so consistent it's such a fragmented, not fragmented, but a very compartmentalized company. But one of the ways they manage that, and I think this is why it points to how they execute so well on that, is that they're single sourcing canonical content about brand stuff from a knowledge graph that informs that Contentful instance. So those are just some examples of like the architectural stuff that can go into that can make the authoring experience make more sense, that you're just like, okay, this is canonical, official branded content from IKEA. We're doing that over here. And it can help the author go like, oh, and then that'll be, that'll populate any number of websites around the world. Yeah.
But I think you said something really important. You said many things that are important in there, but one thing that stood out for me is they have to design, they as an architects and in the infrastructure team and even decision makers have to think about their authors and their experience. And I would argue that many times they don't. The authors are not even invited to the table. They're the last people to see this, and most of the times they see it when it's done. So in other words, they have to
Yeah.
live with it. And I think an important aspect to improve the GUI experience, the entire content experience, is bring the authors at the beginning when it's a blank piece of paper and you're just starting out the project and you're deciding, because that's where you can find out what are your pain points today. What is it that is not working? How do we make this? Every time I did content modeling with clients, I always insisted that at least one content author be there at the beginning designing the content model, because the content model definitely affects them down the line because it represents the GUI that they're going to use later on. What's your take on that?
I 1,000% agree with everything you just said there. It's like that those are your, when you're designing a content management system, the authors are among, if not the most important stakeholders that you're dealing with. And you're right, and they're just way too neglected. I think this has to do with, like, again, I'll just not rant, but I mean, I'll observe that the headless CMS world, it's great. I love the stuff that, like, all these Contentful and content.ai and high graph and sanity, and they're doing, they each have a little niche, each have their own thing going on. But one of the things that they're doing really well is I think the thing they do best in terms of, like, getting their stuff out there is developer relationships. They all have DevRel teams that are
Oh,
just
they all
dedicated
have
to
it
them.
packed down for developers.
Exactly. And that's, which is great. And I was just talking to one of them yesterday, actually, at one of the big headless CMSs. And she was talking, we were talking about, one of the things I didn't mention at the start is that another thing I do is a lot of event organizing. And I've got an event coming up next month called Decoupled Days, which is
Right.
all about decoupled architectures. And she's going to be on a panel that I'm going to convene there about this very issue. And it kind of gets into, like, something that you said earlier also reminded me of this, about, like, we think of this as technology, and there's this, and that dynamic of all these DevRel folks being there, kind of reinforces that it's a technology thing. But as you're talking about, it's like, no, it's about authors as much as it is about the technical implementation
Exactly.
of this. And so it was really heartening to talk to this woman too. She's she's a DevRel for one of the big headless CMSs, and she's just all over the people stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
and talks to the developers about the importance of getting out there. So, like, if there was more of you and her out in the world, we'd be making way more progress on this. But I think, and not to fault developers, I love developers. They're among my best friends, and my last couple of bosses have called me the developer whisperer. That I'm, I love these folks, but they're not. The joke about content strategists is that we're really therapists, and we're helping people with the people issues around this. And that's the thing. And so having, like, and there's a couple of these people that exist out there, like Carrie Hain at Sanity and Michael
Right.
Andrews at content.ai, are
But we
more,
need many more.
we need every headless CMS should have somebody like that, like the content strategy relations person as much as the developer relations person.
I would argue an author rel.
Absolutely. Yeah, to have, like, I'm thinking back, my original training was in journalism, and in newspapers. I don't know if they still exist, but the role of the ombudsperson, the reader advocate for a newspaper, something like what you just said, something like that for the author advocate in any CMS project. And it'll only become more important as decoupled and headless takes off, because I think the old monolithic systems, they had, like, at least some incentive in their product cycle, like, oh yeah, the author's complaining again, we better fix that, do something about it. There may not be similar mechanisms in here, so we're probably going to have to be raising this concern over and over again.
I agree. Another part to making an experience, a content experience better is governance, right? So maybe give us some tips and best practice on that. Let's define governance. What do we mean by it specifically as it relates to composable system? And what is wrong with some of the governance today, and how can we improve it?
Yeah, it's funny. I Part of my move to the Netherlands was I had Lisa Welchman on my podcast a couple of years ago. She's like the leading digital governance guru in the world. She's just like, yeah, she's the person you go to when you have questions about digital governance. And I actually live in the same city as her now. We have had lunch with her last week, and I'm always grilling her about governance. And because part of it is that, like, and the thing that she struggles with as a overarching digital governance expert is that everybody wants her. It's like, oh, you're a design governance person. Oh, you're a digital. Oh, you're an IT governance person. Oh, you're a content governance person. She's like, no, I'm about. She's usually in the C-suite talking to people, but anyhow, but from that level and from her perspective, governance is like, who decides? Like, that's it. It's like, how are these decisions made? And typically in a CMS, you have some technical mechanisms, permission controls and workflow
Mm-hmm.
stuff that you can build in that governs parts of that. But I think there's still that you need to back out from that and do real governance work around, like, who needs to be, like all that stuff, like racy chart stuff, like who's responsible for this, who's accountable, who do you need to talk to, who need to consult, who needs to be informed about this. And having just, like, I've done this a dozen times or hundreds of times probably, where you just have like a grid of, like, who those people are, who's put an R and A and I or a C or an I in there. But that just doesn't happen as much. So I guess the top level thing about governance is that it's, people kind of get it, and I think in the CMS world they often think of it as those workflows and permission setting stuff. But it's, again, I would back out a level to the people stuff that surrounds it. And again, this is an opportunity to really talk to the authors about when and where problems arise, like, how are we going to decide who decides? And often the highest level decision making is probably going to be a level or two above you, but just being cognizant of that, and having ways of elevating things to make sure that there are governance mechanisms. Because I think a lot of times it gets delegated to the IT folks who are implementing the CMS, who are
Right.
maybe not the exact right people to do it.
Yeah, definitely. Like for me, one of the things that I see from a governance perspective, if you're getting very specific to even where you're going at a field level, you're saying how many characters can be entered in this field, right? Um, to me, that is just not a good experience at all, because if you talk to authors for that particular field, which may mean, let's say it's a summary of a blog field, well, that summary could have X number of characters for a web versus a mobile versus. So how do you implement governance at that level without having to say, now we're going to have 4 fields of summary, because one is for mobile, one is for IoT, one is for, do you know what I mean?
Oh, I totally, yeah.
Right now, to me, it seems like even all CMSs, when you go into applying these, just the basics of content governance, it's very still focused on the web page.
Yep. No, I think one of the things there, and this is one of the, AI and LLMs and all that stuff are all the talk everywhere. And this is one of those places, and this isn't new either. But one of the ways to govern that kind of thing is that you're probably likely to still have, like, content stuff happening, maybe not going into a central place, that there'll still be social media stuff happening here and email stuff happening there. And, ideally you want to get as much of that single source as possible, and maybe there are systems that single source parts of that from another place. But anyhow, regardless of how the exact setup, and it's going to be different every place, that's one of the things about decoupled architectures that people really need to get ready for, is that every organization is bespoke and has its own unique needs, and that'll be reflected in the architectures. So a lot of what we're talking about may manifest differently in different organizations. But anyhow, part of that, one of the governance mechanisms you can have there is, like, automation that helps you do voice and tone and style guidance across your channels. Like, just tools like writer.com, or there's others that, in that family of sort of writing assistants. Grammarly, for example, has I think they're working on a new enterprise product that does that. And so just having, like, a writing assistant essentially that kind of looks over your shoulder as an author, wherever you are, whether you're a product content guy, person writing UI copy, or a marketing person, or a email person, whatever your role is, having, and this requires some, not centralized, but at least an agreed upon terminology. That's kind of where your style guide comes from. It's like, here's how we talk about this and that. And that's
Right.
notoriously difficult. You're
I was going to
nodding.
say, good luck with that. Getting an
Exactly.
enterprise, everybody in different departments to agree. No, that's not how we say it in sales. That's not how we say it in marketing. That's not how we say it in product.
Yeah. No, so and you're right. It's not that's not going to be solved anytime soon. But there are governance, but it's not hard to picture the governance mechanisms by which that might happen. And the other thing about that, it's a little bit of a two-way street too, in
Yeah.
that you can have like, I think, the way that like you can do word embeddings and harvest corpuses of information. You can look at your website and all the emails you're sending out and all your internal, correspondence and emails and invoices and all that stuff, and evaluate those, that corpus of information, and begin to get a handle on the language variants across your org, and then start to think about how to tackle that, whether it's like some kind of, like, I know organizations that have like a central, they're never going to centralize all that governance stuff, but they're like, hey, we have this taxonomy person here who is doing her best to align us all on terminology across the enterprise. And if you have a question about words, come to them, for that sort of governed canonical list of how we talk about stuff. Again, really hard to implement, lots of details to it,
Yeah.
but at least starting to make the effort, I think, is worth it.
How do you see, I'm interested in your take on this, but how do you see artificial intelligence perhaps helping in this? Are
Well, it
there
already
tools out
is.
there that you know of already?
Yeah, like May Habib at writer.com. She used to, what was it called before Writer? Oh shoot. There was another name. It was another, but essentially a writing assistant that's that does both. I don't know. I haven't played with it enough, but it does generative AI stuff, so it can help marketing copywriters and other kinds of writers do stuff. But it also has some like voice and tone and style governance kind of stuff built into it, and there's other tools as well. So that's one take on it. That's one way that AI will manifest. I think AI, there's just a lot of implications of it. One, I think, is a big one right now. I'm convinced that a lot of executives are convinced that they can get rid of a bunch of writers and have Chat GPT do it, and that they're just making blanket decisions to eliminate X% of content roles with that in mind, and which I think is very short-sighted. Like, there's any number of places where you can show that, like, you need more writers to do this stuff right, because we're like the role of prompt engineer, for example. Like, that was the famous article like 6 months ago about, like, hey, the new jobs, prompt engineer, you're going to make 300,000 a year. It's like, no, it's the exact same thing that content designers do every day, and it's also just a core competency that all of us will need going forward. So just that notion. So I think, and that kind of points at the impact of AI, that like we need, as any kind of practitioner in the content world, to understand like the implication, like that implication that, like, hey, the C-suite's probably not getting it. We're probably going to be understaffed for a while. All the more pressure on us to figure out how to use these tools in the most efficient way, to figure out like how they can help us, because they can a lot. Like, if you just need to summarize a list of things for a listicle or some procedure you're doing, Chat GPT can do a great job of a first draft of that. You're not going to ship that copy. You're going to need to edit it and work it
You
over
hope they
quite a
won't
bit.
ship it.
Yeah, no. Oh, I know. I won't say who or where, but I was talking to somebody in a big enterprise the other day that they have Chat GPT generated content live in the wild on their corporate website. And I'm like, man, I hope your brand holds up under that pressure.
Right. Right. Well, they'll find out. They'll find out
Yeah,
soon.
they'll
I
find
mean,
out soon enough, and then they'll hire some more writers to fix it,
exactly.
and the cycle will continue. But anyhow, I think those are just a couple of the big implications right now. Yeah, and there's, like I said, it's big and it's everywhere. It's
Yeah.
just going to affect every nook and cranny of our work.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's talk a little bit about personalization. And in a traditional legacy system, you go one place, you say, I want to personalize this product. It's all the data is coming from there. In a composable system where you have customer information, Salesforce, product information, your PIM, content in your Headless CMS, and whatever other systems, how do you personalize all that information, right? How does and how do you make a content experience that is easy for an author to manage all that content and be able to also personalize it?
Yeah. Well, I think the overarching thing there that you need is a metadata strategy, because that's the only way you have a chance, any kind of chance at executing genuine large scale personalization. And the simplest way I look at that is like you just mentioned, like, okay, you got all your customer information in your CRM, like Salesforce or something like that. And then you have your content over here. Your customers are expressing an intent over here. You have content that's designed for a purpose over here. You need the metadata is this thing that can stitch them together to say, like, for example, I worked at Expedia, and travel stuff is a great use case for that. You have content about, like, kiddie pools and slides, and then you have information about a family that's vacationing. You give them that content. You don't give the business person the information about the slide
Right.
and the kiddie pool. You give them the information about the bar side, the poolside bar that has good Wi-Fi, so they can get some work done while they have a beer after work. So that's all driven by metadata. It's all like you've tagged your content in some kind of way to, you've enriched it with metadata that says maybe a little bit more than you would now, because I think most people have some kind of taxonomical categorizations of their content, but maybe you just enrich it a little more metadata, and that'll be an ever escalating thing too. You'll learn, like, oh, people are looking for this. We haven't tagged our content. We need to figure out a way to categorize it that way. And you'll constantly be learning from your customers, like, oh crap, there's a pandemic. Everybody changed their travel behavior,
Right.
the highest level, all the way down to like little fashionable trends in, like, oh, I only want to go to bars that have fancy cocktails, and then all the way up and down that spectrum. The way you are able to match that customer intent and affinities, things they like, with your purposeful, intentful content, it's the metadata that stitches it together. So that's at a high level. That's I think what needs to happen.
So you're talking about more automation of that personalization by setting up the infrastructure to be able to have it automated. In other words, through all of this metadata. So the authors focus less on how to create the personalization, let the system do that, the algorithm, quote unquote, do that, versus but set it up properly with all the metadata. And I would imagine even in that point, AI definitely would be able to help.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's a whole other thing. That's like
With learning models, language
exactly the world of,
models, and yeah.
yeah, knowledge models, and even things like knowledge graph technology, to have one of the possible applications of that is like a knowledge mesh, where you have like a instead of like just nobody's ever going to bust silos and connect enterprises in this kumbaya moment. That's not coming anytime soon. But you do have a chance of understanding what's going on in the silos, reconciling those at a higher level in some kind of an information mesh that that understands, how people talk about stuff and what they have. Same thing works in personalization, that you can have like that higher level. That's kind of what I'm talking about with the metadata strategy
Right.
for personalization, very analogous to that. I think one of the places, do you know Factor Firm up in Seattle? It's like it's a really good information architecture consultancy. They have this model. I've seen 1,000, these enterprise architecture models, that describe how you might do all this stuff. Theirs is really simple. It's like you got systems, you have an information layer, and then you have applications, where you're serving stuff out. And it's like, so all this stuff is happening in an information layer in the middle, taxonomies, ontologies, all those kinds of like systems and mechanisms to ascribe ascribe metadata to something and then to do something with it. That's where it's, to really oversimplify it, you just need information about what you got so that you can connect the systems, the stuff that you have in your systems, with the end users who need it. And content is a huge part of that, obviously.
So very closely related to personalization is localization, right? The ability not just to translate, but localize, which many people think localization is just translation, and it's not. It's actually localization, because even in the US, you go different states and different things mean different for different people, right? Same with any other country in the world. How do we improve that experience for authors?
Boy, that's a huge one. And I've become very attuned to that. I moved to Europe about 3 or 4 months ago. And in the US, I hang out a lot with content designers, the product content folks at places, that build all these new SaaS apps and stuff. In the US, most of those people come out of like copywriting, journalism, those kind of things. In Europe, everybody comes out of localization. So I've been really exposed a lot to localization and localization issues here. And it's huge. It's like you just said, even in the US, which has a monoculture, as monocultural as you can get, and it's this huge place, you still have like, do you call it soda or do you call it pop or do you call it Coke? You know, it's like there's that.
Right.
Just multiply that by about 10,000. You know, when you think about just in the European Union, there's like something like 40 some official languages and probably 80 or 100 different cultures, you know, that you're dealing with. And you're right. So in terms of content, dealing with localizing content for not just language, you know, that's the first, like a first step in it, but then to make it culturally like appropriate. Like they're just like idiomatic things that you wouldn't do from culture to culture. So you can't just translate, you know, to get things, even at just a basic language level. You may need, at the very least, like idiomatic alignment. But then also very quickly you get into like idiomatic appropriateness. Like some things might be like not safe for work, or you know, there's any number of ways that can go haywire. Even before the web, there was this whole thing about marketing stuff about the Chevy Nova not selling in Latin America because Nova, well,
Because
you're
it stands for doesn't go.
yeah,
Nova.
Nova. Exactly. And so that's
There's
been a thing.
there's worse
Yeah.
examples, to be honest with you, on car branding that I can't share here just because of the name they used in the car is actually, I'm from Argentina originally, and the name they used in the car was actually a bad slang word in Argentina, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to name it or anything, but yeah, that's, I mean, right, in any other part of the world that meant nothing else but the name of the car. So it shows the importance of understanding cultures and locales, right?
Yeah. And then in terms of like having that understanding and then figuring out what to do with that understanding in your organization. Like there's so many different ways you can localize, and that has
Mm-hmm.
huge implications for how you manage your content. Like some places do full-blown transcreation, which is like this notion of like you're designing in the product world, and even in the marketing world, I think they do this, where you're like you have like a whole parallel team that's working on the design, the engineering, the content around an experience for a specific locale. That's the most extreme version of it, where you essentially, you know, have like parallel development teams doing stuff. And then there's this continuum back up to just like pure, quick, easy, simple machine translation of the text, you know, with strings. But there's a whole continuum between those of various ways that you can, you know, kind of tidy up and each step further down to that true transcreation process is like a better experience for the end user. And to be honest, I don't, you know, that's a whole other parallel universe of authoring, because there's usually typically like the product people coming up with what you have, and then there's a localization people going like, oh, that's a cool product, let's put it into Italy and Spain and France and wherever else. And then, you know, and then again, that's where that continuum of implementation comes in. So that's a huge kettle of fish right there, and it has implications for, you know, for example, one of the classic things in content design is like, great, you came up with a string, you know how you're going to advance people along their journey at this point. Now translate it into German, which is notoriously long. It just, everything gets long in German. And a lot of times you'll just break the layout, you know, as soon as you do that. So that's just
Right,
one,
exactly.
that's just one example of, you know, and then you can like break your brand by doing some culturally inappropriate, like, rude slang in Argentina. You're offending people, you know, with your,
Right. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
And it's
So
not just text, it's also images, right? The imagery, you may have to change it up based on the locale.
exactly. I've had friends who do a lot of localization presentations, and they'll use the example of like, you can't just, so again, like back to a travel website. Like if you're selling travel to, you know, people in Nigeria, you're not going to have like Europeans on the beach. You're going to have like Africans on the beach in Dakar. You know, it's like that just, you know, so and again, that gets back into the personalization stuff I was talking about, where your metadata enrichment of assets, like, you know, like the characteristics of like, oh, this is a beach, this is a mountain, this is young people, this is old people. You know, you kind of have all that's another, it's analogous to localization, and like that you're contextualizing information. That's what personalization is. It's a very
Yeah.
analogous to localization in that way.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, I forgot a couple of questions left because we're pretty much out of time. Can't believe it's going
Oh,
to be almost an hour. It's a great conversation we're having here. Um, how do we balance in a composable system that one of the keys is flexibility, at least from the developer side, flexibility to switch systems, to put in new systems, remove old systems, to keep improving, right? How do we balance that flexibility on the authoring side with consistency, which, like you said, you mentioned IKEA, which is a great one, right? Where it doesn't matter where you go to an IKEA in the world, their marketing, their branding, it's pretty much consistent. You can go to any of them and, it's going to be the same thing everywhere. How do you manage that from an authoring perspective to enforce consistency, but still at the same time allow for this flexibility?
yeah, that's a tricky one. And in these decoupled systems, because there's that whole one of the key concepts that underlies that whole scheme is the notion of separation of concerns. Like an author, I would argue, should just be concerned with like getting the right information in there to answer a question or to deliver information. That's their concern, and everything about the authoring environment should support that. We're still teasing away, the old presentation layer stuff about like you were saying, like, oh, and this needs to be read. It's like, no, it needs to be emphasized. It doesn't need to be a particular presentation of it. But and I think in terms of like, yeah, like in terms of like the systems design and all, it's going to depend so much on each individual organization, like those separation of concerns. What are the concerns? Again, it gets back to governance. Like, who decides what those concerns are? Who has authority over that realm to say, like, it's really important that we do things this way. That, like, working in pharmaceutical stuff, there's all this regulatory compliance and safety and FDA stuff and other drug agencies around the world. Like, in that kind of thing, that's a very specific need for authoring systems that prevent you from doing something that'll get you thrown in jail or fined,
Right.
versus, so it's going to vary a lot. And in terms of designing the systems around that, again, it's just all bespoke. It's just kind of like in that kind of situation, you might want to use like an old, like I don't know if you know the DITA format and componentized content management systems that are very precise, and the boxes you put things in are really well articulated and can enable that kind of control. Whereas, like, if you're just doing a marketing site for like a ski shop or something, you're not going to have that concern. So yeah, in terms of like the designing the kind of the right sizing of like what level at which you're figuring that out, that's the $64,000 question
Right.
in modular architectures, is like, but it's all about that separating out. So I guess the task in designing this kind of stuff is like figuring out what those concerns are for your organization or the project you're working on, who's going to decide like how you address that concern, and then figuring out a system that can implement that.
Yeah. Yeah. The final thing that I wanted to talk about was version control. In a headless CMS, you can easily roll back to different things. But in a composable system that is made up of multiple systems, how do you implement version control when rolling back an entry, let's say, could actually involve data or content from multiple systems? So how do you implement a version control for
Yeah,
something like
that's
that? And maybe this is another $64,000 question, right? But
no, it's a great one, because it's you think about like Git, just the that's one mechanism by which technically you can understand what prior versions were and restore them. And I know that there's like what is it, Terminus? I haven't played with it at all, but I saw a demo of Terminus DB or Terminus CMS, which is kind of like they kind of combine like Git stuff, Git versioning, and other mechanisms, to roll back. It kind of like, it's one of those like cloud-based kind of things that
mm-hmm.
that takes a snapshot at every juncture of change. So there are mechanisms out there for that, but I'm not aware of like, there's nothing to my understanding I don't know that there's anything remotely resembling best practices around that, because like I think part of what you're getting at is like, okay, you have this authoring system over here, and maybe you have some kind of interactivity on the front end where people are submitting stuff, or whatever. There's other inputs into that.
Or a
How do you
PIM
resolve?
product coming from a PIM, right?
Yeah,
That
like,
you
yeah,
now you
the
have to
PIM
roll
versus
back.
like the product marketing guys copy versus the product
Exactly.
designers stuff. Yeah, and I think that's, I'm a content architect and I haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah. Well, and the
I'm kind
idea
of,
with this
yeah,
conversation is that we need to bring all this information out in the open and talk about it. Not that we're going to decide today. And otherwise, we'd be making a lot more money if we had all the answers to this. And we
exactly.
wouldn't need another episode, right? So of the
No,
podcast.
you got to keep doing this. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Job security.
Exactly.
Larry, it's been a pleasure as always. To close it up, what does the future look like for content experiences or let me rephrase that. What would you like it to look like if you had the full power to control this?
Boy, I guess, if I had the full power, I don't know. It would be dangerous to put me in charge, so don't even think about that. But no, but I think my fondest dream would be to figure out a way to help people really understand the genuine benefits that can unfold from this. Because I think right now, just one little data point, and I don't mean to diss anybody, but like 93% of the implementations of headless architectures that I've seen have been just like teasing out like the headless CMS from the web front end so that marketing people can build landing pages faster. And I'm like, great, that's one thing you could do. But it's like, but I think, but even with that, even though that's a suboptimal usage of all this stuff, the thing about that is even like kind of like a minimal implementation of the benefits of these decoupled systems, at least by doing that, you've got the talent in house now. You've figured out like, oh, we can manage content separately over here, and we have a development team that's developing the front end separately over here. So you at least have like among your technical talent and your IT, systems management talent, the concept that this is possible. So I guess the upshot of that is like, you don't have to do it perfectly out of the gate. Just do anything if you see a benefit in
Baby
it. I mean,
steps.
yeah, take baby steps. And if you're a person like a visionary like me, like I have to back away and calm myself down all the time about this. But just that notion of like, just do a proof of concept, do one small thing, show the benefits of it. And then
Improve only one small section of your department as opposed to thinking, oh, we've got to change everything.
exactly. No boiling the ocean, as the
Yeah.
consultants say. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, so baby steps. I think that would be,
Yeah.
it's weird to have that as your fondest dream, but if people could just learn to take baby steps, I'd be
Oh, I
happy.
agree. I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, completely with you. Well, Larry, it's been a pleasure as always, man. I'm so glad we got to chat again.
Yeah, likewise. Always a pleasure, Marcelo.
Yeah, definitely. Now, we see your email on the screen there. Is there any other place, LinkedIn, they can get you, or if they
Well,
want to?
I also do a podcast. The information's on
Oh,
the
yeah.
media on the
Give it.
website.
Give the podcast name.
Yeah, it's called Content Strategy
It's a great
Insights.
podcast.
Thank you. And it's just dropped episode 152, I think.
Wow.
So it's getting up there and I'm having way too much fun with it. But it's but that's also at lsmedia.com. Just look for the podcast link there. That's my main other thing. So yeah.
Awesome. Larry, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Likewise. Thanks so much, Marcelo.
And thanks to the rest of you. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and stay tuned for many more episodes. Like always, if you want to get a hold of me, just email me, marcelo@headlesscreator.com. So we'll see you on the next one. Cheers, everybody.